Una Spencer, the wife of Ahab in the novel Ahab's Wife, or The Stargazer, reminds us in our reading that we are part of, kin to the stars in the sky. She demonstrates the need and the purpose of a third place, a place where you can go and reflect about your life, a place that reminds you of your place in the order of things, a place where you are simultaneously very small under the great night sky, and a place where you are also your own right size, watching it all. In the novel, she meets Ms. Maria Mitchell, budding astronomer, Quaker, and then friend to the Unitarians. Una gives us an example of the in-between place, the third place, that we all need in our lives to take care of our spirits. Sometimes our hearts break apart, and sometimes they break open. The other place that I think of as a third place is the congregation. We are our own selves in our churches, but we are also part of an organization bigger than ourselves, a faith made up of values that we can make real together as individuals. Part of this process is trying to articulate what those values are and how we make them visible in the world. And this is the moment where I put on my history nerd hat. The Unitarians and the Universalists, throughout their separate and combined histories, created many statements of faith or beliefs. In 1790, the Universalists created this declaration of faith and then added something important: the Liberty Clause. Basically, the Declaration of Faith shared the church's beliefs as a whole, and then the Liberty Clause allowed for a variety of individual interpretations, stating, "Neither this nor any other statement shall be imposed as a creedal test, provided that the faith thus indicated be professed." So they wrote a creed, and then decided that individual conscience should be an important part of how that creed is interpreted. The Unitarians were even more focused on individual freedom and right of conscience. The Unitarians organized themselves that early as an association of churches, independent congregations who developed their own individual covenants. Think corporate statements of purpose, not statements of belief. Because Unitarianism means we reject the Trinity, that we believe, God is one, and that we believe in following the life of Jesus, we depended on individual churches to adopt these ideas. And the messages were provided by the clergy in the churches, mostly in New England, so layers of interpretation. In 1925, the American Unitarian Association wrote a statement expressing the predominantly practical emphasis of Unitarianism. I'm quoting from a book of essays. "We value our doctrines only so far as they are the revelation and will of God, and so far as they tend to improve the religious, moral, and intellectual condition of mankind. The great end of this association is the promotion of pure morals and practical piety." So we know from this that the Unitarians are focused on figuring out how to live their lives in ways that made their values visible. That's what piety means, how to live religiously. They weren't focused on telling people what to believe, only helping them figure out the how of living their religious lives. In college, I took an American politics class, and my professor, Mr. Chris Pyle, found out that I wanted to be a Unitarian Universalist minister. And he began teasing me. Every single week, he would make fun of the Unitarians and the Universalists. One joke in particular stands out in this sermon, in the context of this sermon. He asked me, "What happened when the Unitarians and the Congregationalists split?" I don't know, Mr. Pyle. What happened? The Unitarians kept the furniture, and the Congregationalists kept the faith. I'm going to come back to Mr. Pyle, don't worry. You can imagine I was unhappy. So now it's the Universalists' time to shine. The Universalists adopted the Winchester Confession in 1803 at a convention in, of course, Winchester, New Hampshire. And then they changed their profession of faith, their creed, again in 1899, and then again in 1935, adding contemporary language each time. Over and over, the Universalists documented their common faith of universal salvation, that God is a loving God and that human beings will be restored to relationship through God's love. So we have this value of individual conscience. It's all throughout our history. And you can see it too in American history, in our nation's development, particularly in the Constitution, even though that document at the time only applied to white men. We have this value of the right of conscience and these covenants, not creeds, of how we are going to be together for our guides. And the way these covenants and professions of faith are written, they don't include everyone. So you can imagine what happens next, right? We are going to change them. Every few years, we are going to rewrite our covenant as we learn and grow as religious people. Now, for some, I would imagine all these changes in church creeds and church covenants brought up a lot of feelings. Just like the changes in our principles and purposes brought up a lot of feelings at this most recent General Assembly. What has helped me is taking the balcony view, or perhaps I should say, in Maria's story, the view from the stairs. In our time for all ages, Maria Mitchell went up and down the stairs a lot. I thought of those stairs as a liminal place, an in-between place. In between the place that she loved, the balcony where she found her comet, and the downstairs where her family congregated, another part of love, where she was part of a community. And later in life, she found more communities. She became a professional astronomer. She became a professor at Vassar College, a women's college, and so on. But those stairs were the in-between place. She was either coming to somewhere or going from somewhere, a third place. And we are always going and coming places. What do our roots tell us about the Universalists and the Unitarians? I want to go back to 1637 in Dedham, Massachusetts. Reverend Alice Blair Wesley, a historian and a lay theologian, gave a series of lectures called the Men's Lectures in 2001. They're on the internet. You can read them. Fact check me. They happen every year. Reverend Wesley tells us that the folks who came from England first had to design a town government. And once they had allotments for houses and fields, had tended to their animals, they could start thinking about a church. But they didn't know each other all that well because all that other work had taken so much time. So guess what they did? They set up a series of weekly neighborhood meetings, each with a discussion question, shared ahead of time so that they could reflect on those questions. And the record shows that they met on Thursdays. These meetings went over a year with the church being founded in 1638. The foundational concern of the Dedham people was not the Bible. The foundational concern of this free church was for the justice, the peace, the laws and regulations, the conditions of any healthy, free society. After their broken hearts had left the tumult of English society, they wanted to be as intentional as they could. They assumed that the strongest, clearest, most authentic voice in their whole society for justice, peace, and reasonable laws would come from the free church. The purpose of the church, in their terms, was to love God and to love one another so well that members would learn together the divine will of the loving God for the whole society, insofar as it relates to justice, peace, and reasonable laws. And if they achieved their goal, the members would be called, compelled, and bound to proclaim it and bring it to bear in their whole society. You hear in these quotes and this story that God is a loving God, that the structure of the community they are building is a justice and peace focused structure, as much as they are able to make it get one, given the context that they have. Our background comes from them and from Europe and from a whole host of ancestors who were angling for the freedom of conscience and a loving God. We are still on the stairs, looking at our history, seeing the through line of the concept of conscience and a loving God. Alice Blair Wesley argues that the pieces tying our history together are not just the beliefs that people shared or their covenantal way of being, and not just the shared loyalties that the people carried with them, but all three. These are the values that the Dedham people have to teach us as we experience these recent changes in our Article 2 bylaw revisions. The Dedham folks came to a conclusion after all those meetings about what their purpose would be. It read, "Members of the new free church should be joined together in a covenant of religious loyalty to the spirit of love. And once the members are joined in a covenant of their own writing and signing, the members' loyalty should be only to the spirit of love, working only in their hearts and minds." Once again, love and conscience. Reflection leading to a shared covenant, loyal to the spirit of love. But before we can jump to the present day, I want to talk about another painful piece of our history and broken hearts. I want to point out that we have experienced this process of having broken hearts in our faith community and gone through the process of being apart and then being open-hearted again. Parker J. Palmer, in his book, Healing the Heart of Democracy, The Courage to Create a Politics Worthy of the Human Spirit, reclaims the word heart. He reminds us that the word comes from the Latin cor and points not only to our emotions, but to the core of the self, that center place where all our ways of knowing converge: intellectual, emotional, sensory, intuitive, imaginative, experiential, relational, bodily, all of the ways of knowing. The heart is the place where we integrate what we know in our minds with what we know in our bones, the place where our knowledge becomes more fully human. When what we understand of self and world comes together in the center place called the heart, we are more likely to find the courage to act humanely on what we know. That's going to be really important as we experience this election season. We are more likely to find the courage to act humanely on what we know when we have integrated what we know of self and world. That's an important one to remember. It's what our Dedham ancestors were trying to do with their intentional building of their community and their church. Parker Palmer says there are two ways your heart can break. It can break apart, leading to anger, depression, and disengagement. Or if your heart breaks open into a greater capacity to hold the complexities and contradictions of human experience, the result may be new life. And I don't know about you, but when I read this piece about heart breaking open instead of apart, my whole body sagged. Yes. So many of us have had our hearts broken by recent events, by the war in Gaza and other conflicts, by the Supreme Court, by yet another high-stakes election. We have a lot to be brokenhearted about, and we also have the tools to care for our hearts. Our covenant and our conscience tells us that that is one piece of the truth. One historian referred to this piece of our history as the Black empowerment controversy, and former Unitarian Universalist Association president, the first Black person to hold this office, the Reverend Dr. William Singford, refers to it as the Black empowerment tragedy. You can decide which will break your heart open and not apart. In 1968, the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly attendees were about 1/3 people of color. Our engagement with the civil rights movement had opened the doors for more people to join our communities. The General Assembly voted to allocate $1 million of its budget to the Black Affairs Council, BAC. At General Assembly in 1968, there was a motion to allocate more funds to Black and White Action, as well as the Black Affairs Council. The organization BAWA was made up of both white people and people of color. The Black Affairs Council saw this vote for funding as a split of Unitarian Universalism's focus, and once again, not supporting Black leadership. Led by Hayward Henry, now known as Dr. Mtangulizi Saniika, now our Presbyterian elder, the members of the Black Affairs Council, white allies, and others staged a walkout at General Assembly. Many of these folks never returned to Unitarian Universalism. The hurt and pain caused by the lack of support for people of color within Unitarian Universalism is not limited to these events in the 1960s. For many years, folks have shared stories of being hurt by Unitarian Universalist members of their communities, knowing that pain and history led members of the Unitarian Universalist Board of Trustees to decide to allocate $3.5 million to the new organization, Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, or BLUE, in 2016. Adopting a new principle and funding a new organization are pieces of collective liberation and ways we can break our hearts open, not apart. Ways we can step down from the stairs and wade into the work of liberation together. Our work of changing our faith to better service as Unitarian Universalists has always continued. In 2013, we introduced the 8th principle and our most recent revisions of Article 2, the bylaw change that articulates our principles and purposes in a new way in 2022. And 2 years of study have led us to 2024. And it shows that when we know better, we can do better, in the words of Maya Angelou. As is our way, none of these changes were made without deep thought. Time in that liminal space that allows us to reflect on what needs to change, what needs to be different, and what is working for us right now. And pretty much every time in our history, everyone had big feelings about changes to our principles and purposes. People argued with each other. People wrote essays and newsletter articles and had small group meetings over the last 2 years of study, especially, just like in Dedham, Massachusetts. And ministers wrote sermons about them. We are people who believe deeply in the right of conscience and the ability to make our own decisions while understanding that we also need to be part of communities that care for us and help us throughout our lives. And we are people that need to hold that creative tension of who we have been, who we are now, and who we can be in the future. The aspiration part of breaking your heart open will be key for us right now and throughout this lead up to the election. If you were not able to attend General Assembly this year or was not aware that this was the year delegates were voting on these revisions, I want you to know that the General Assembly passed the Article 2 revisions of our bylaws by an 80% vote. If you look at your order of service, this image is now going to be the image that we are going to see a lot of our values. As you can see, love is at the center with our chalice, and our values are now named as justice, interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, and generosity. Some religious educators have come up with this fantastically, delightfully whimsical image of a pig with a jetpack on its back. Known as Jet Pig or J Piglet with love at the center, Jet Pig has proven to be a really fabulous, fun way to teach ourselves about these new values. So, Jet Pig, J for justice, E for equity, T for transformation, P for pluralism, I for independence, and G for generosity. So Jet Pig is not without controversy, but I'm going to let Lucas tell you all about that at some point. So I love this Jet Pig. He just makes me giggle. And he brings us back to the Dedham folks and the folks seeking love and understanding in the 1960s and now. Love really is at the center of our faith. We can trace that love throughout our history at every turn. Even as the liberal church changes and grows, love is there. When our hearts break, they can break apart or open. My colleague and friend, the Reverend Amanda Schuber, was recently part of a team running an interfaith mission camp with 48 children of varying denominational beliefs. Only 2 were Unitarian Universalist, and Reverend Schuber ministers in Macon, Georgia. She spent 90 minutes teaching the children and counselors about Unitarian Universalism using the image and concept of jet pig. She reports that at the end of the week, after visiting several other faith communities to learn as well, they could all recite Unitarian Universalist values. Amanda had a toy pig and she designed a jetpack for it. The kids fell in love with the pig and the pack. Many of the kids said how much they wanted to come to a church that had so much fun teaching about what they believed. Something to remember, that our faith can be fun. So bringing it back to Professor Chris Pyle, when he made his joke about the Unitarians keeping the furniture and the Congregationalists keeping the faith. Remember, it had been weeks of jokes, and I had had my limit. And with a frustrated look on my face, I asked him what faith tradition he had been raised in. Oh, I was raised Unitarian on Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. So he knew exactly how to make fun of himself and me without letting me in on the joke. So it's so much more fun when we can laugh together. But I have never forgotten that. As we continue onwards towards the election, I invite you to remember and pause on the stairs or in an elevator, somewhere where you can breathe deeply and calmly in an in-between space. Take some time to ponder Una and Maria's stars. Remember that we come from a long line of people who keep fighting for justice and peace. Remember that at the center of our being is love. Remember to laugh every once in a while. And remember that you are Unitarian Universalist, and the folks in 1637 Dedham would be astonished at what their covenant created and what love has brought to us. Remember that when your heart feels like it is breaking apart, that you have the tools to bring it back together and help it break open instead. May it be so.